If you drive south along the Florida coast today, just 14 miles from the historic streets of St. Augustine, you will come across a peaceful, glistening inlet of water. It is a place of natural beauty, where the Atlantic Ocean pushes into the marshes. But on maps, this inlet bears a name that stands as a dark scar on the landscape. It is called the Matanzas River. In Spanish, Matanzas means slaughters. It is not named for the fish in the water or the game in the woods. It is named for the blood of hundreds of men that once stained the white sands red. This is the story of the Fort Caroline Massacre. It is a tale of a forgotten war for the soul of North America, a story where the wrath of a hurricane and the zeal of a holy war collided in the swamps of Florida. It is the moment that decided whether America would speak French or Spanish, and it remains one of the most brutal yet overlooked tragedies in colonial history. To understand how this slaughter happened, we must look back to the year 1564. The New World was a vast, open chessboard, and the powers of Europe were making their moves. For decades, Spain had claimed all of North America as its own, granted by the Pope himself. They called it La Florida, but the Spanish had failed time and time again to tame this wild land. Seeing an opening, France made its move. But these were not just any Frenchmen. They were Huguenots, French Protestants seeking freedom from religious persecution back home. Led by the nobleman René Goulain de Laudonnière, hundreds of settlers arrived at the mouth of the St. John's River near modern-day Jacksonville. They built a triangular wooden fortress and named it Fort Caroline in honor of their king, Charles IX. At first there was hope. The local Timucua people were friendly, trading corn and fish. The French believed they had found a paradise where they could worship freely and strike it rich. But paradise quickly turned into a purgatory. The heat was oppressive. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The soil was sandy and difficult to farm. Within months, supplies ran low. Relationships with the Timucua soured as the French unwittingly inserted themselves into local tribal wars. Mutiny brewed within the fort. Some soldiers stole ships to become pirates, raiding Spanish vessels in the Caribbean. And that was the spark that lit the fuse. When news reached King Philip II of Spain that French heretics, Protestants, had built a fort on his land and were attacking his ships, he was apoplectic. This was not just a territorial dispute. It was a religious affront. The Spanish treasure fleet, carrying the silver that funded the Spanish Empire, sailed right past the Florida coast. A French pirate base, there was a dagger at the throat of Spain's economy. King Philip turned to his most capable, ruthless commander, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. Menéndez was a man of iron will and deep Catholic faith. His orders were simple and chilling. Go to Florida, build a base, find the French, and eliminate them. In late August 1565, Menéndez arrived in Florida. He spotted the French ships anchored off the coast of Fort Caroline. He didn't hide his intentions. He sailed his galleon, the San Pelio, right up to the French flagship. When the French captain shouted across the water, asking who he was, Menéndez replied that he had come to hang and behead all Lutherans he found. The French cut their anchor cables and fled into the night. Menéndez, unable to catch them, sailed south about 35 miles and established a crude outpost. He named it St. Augustine. It would become the oldest continuously occupied European city in the United States, but in 1565, it was little more than a muddy trench filled with desperate soldiers. Now the stage was set for a deadly race. Back at Fort Caroline, the French received reinforcements. The famous naval commander Jean Ribault arrived with fresh troops and supplies. He took command from Laudonnière. Ribault was aggressive. He knew the Spanish had just landed south of them. He decided he would not wait to be attacked. He would take the fleet, sail down to St. Augustine, and crush the Spanish before they could fortify their position. Laudonnière, who had been in Florida longer, begged him not to go. He warned of the hurricane season. He warned that taking all the soldiers would leave the women, children, and sick men at Fort Caroline defenseless. Ribault ignored him. He loaded 600 of the colony's best men onto his ships and sailed south. It was a gamble that would cost them everything. As the French fleet arrived off the coast of St. Augustine ready to bombard the Spanish, the sky turned black. The wind began to howl. A massive hurricane, one of the fiercest recorded in the century, slammed into the coast. The storm was so violent it blew the French ships miles down the coast, smashing them against the dunes and sandbars. On land at St. Augustine, Pedro Menéndez watched the storm rage. He realized something that his own officers thought was madness. He knew that the French fleet had been blown away. He also knew that if the French fleet was down south, Fort Caroline, 35 miles to the north, was virtually empty. Menéndez made a decision that defines military audacity. He ordered 500 of his men to march north overland to attack Fort Caroline. It was a suicide mission. They had to march through the hurricane. The rain fell in sheets. They waded through swamps up to their waists, holding their weapons above their heads to keep the gunpowder dry. They hacked through dense sawgrass and palmetto scrub, sleeping in mud, driven only by the fanatical will of their commander. For 3 days they marched. On the morning of September 20th, just before dawn, they reached the edge of the woods near Fort Caroline. Inside the fort, the French were asleep. The sentries had been allowed to go back to bed because of the driving rain. No one believed an enemy could attack in such weather. With a cry of Santiago, the Spanish poured over the walls. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Spanish soldiers, hardened veterans, moved through the muddy streets of the settlement, cutting down anyone in their path. Laudonnière, the fort's founder, managed to escape over the wall in his nightshirt, fleeing into the swamp with a handful of others. But for the rest, 132 men, there was no escape. They were put to the sword. The women and children were spared, but the dream of a French colony was burned to the ground along with the fort. But the tragedy was not over. The true horror was yet to come. Down the coast, the hurricane had subsided. Jean Ribault and hundreds of his soldiers were shipwrecked. They were alive, but they were stranded on the beaches south of St. Augustine, starving, thirsty, and cut off from their base by inlets and rivers they couldn't cross. Menéndez soon learned of the survivors. He marched his men south to the inlet, now known as Matanzas. On the other side of the water, the French were desperate. They saw the Spanish and signaled for a parley. A French officer swam across to negotiate. He begged Menéndez for a ship to take them back to France. He offered a ransom. He appealed to the codes of chivalry that usually governed warfare between European nations. Menéndez was unmoved. He told the Frenchmen that he had captured Fort Caroline and killed everyone there. He demanded the French surrender unconditionally. He promised nothing, saying only that he would treat them as God directed him. Starving and broken, the French had no choice. They surrendered. Menéndez ordered the French to be brought across the inlet in a canoe, 10 at a time. As each group arrived on the Spanish side, they were taken behind a sand dune, out of sight of their comrades on the other bank. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They were asked if they were Catholics. A few, mostly the musicians and mechanics, said yes. They were spared. The rest, staunch Huguenots, confessed their Protestant faith. Menéndez gave the signal. The Spanish soldiers drew their knives and daggers. Group by group, 10 by 10, they were led behind the dunes and slaughtered. The sand turned red. A few days later, the second wave of survivors, led by Commander Jean Ribault himself, arrived at the inlet. The same scene played out. Ribault, a man of high status, believed he would be ransomed. He was wrong. When Ribault realized his fate, he reportedly quoted a psalm and said, "We are of earth, and to earth we must return." He was stabbed to death along with his men. In total, nearly 350 Frenchmen were executed at that inlet over those 2 weeks. Before he died, Menéndez reportedly told the French that he did this, not as to Frenchmen but as to Lutherans. To him, this was not a war crime. It was an act of cleansing. He believed he was saving the New World from the infection of heresy. News of the massacre eventually reached Europe. The French court was horrified, but they were too weak, torn apart by their own religious civil wars, to declare war on Spain. However, the massacre did not go entirely unanswered. 3 years later, a French nobleman named Dominique de Gourgues, who was not a Huguenot but a Catholic outraged by the insult to France, sailed to Florida privately. He enlisted the help of the Timucua Indians, who had come to hate the Spanish. Together, they attacked the Spanish garrison now occupying Fort Caroline. In a grim echo of history, de Gourgues captured the Spanish soldiers. He hanged them from the same trees where Menéndez had hanged the French. Above their bodies, he placed a sign that read, "Not as to Spaniards, but as to traitors, robbers, and murderers," but the damage was done. France never again seriously attempted to colonize Florida. The peninsula remained Spanish for another 200 years. Today, Fort Caroline is a quiet national memorial in Jacksonville. A replica of the fort stands near the river, surrounded by moss-draped oaks. It is a peaceful place, usually empty of crowds. And down the coast, at the Matanzas Inlet, fishermen cast their lines and tourists walk the beach, often unaware that beneath their feet lies the memory of a pivotal moment in history. If the hurricane had veered east, if Ribault had stayed in the fort, if Menéndez had been less fanatical, the entire history of the United States might have been different. The official language of the South might have been French. The religious history of America might have taken a different turn. But history is often decided by the thin line between a storm and a safe harbor, and by the ruthless will of men who believe they are doing the work of God. The Fort Caroline Massacre is a reminder that the map of the world we know today was drawn not just with ink, but with blood. Thank you for listening to this account of the tragedy at Fort Caroline. If you found this story compelling, there are many more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of the past. Thanks for watching. If you learned anything, or if I at least entertained you today, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. The almighty algorithm decides who gets recommended my videos based on the amount of views versus likes and subscriptions. I wish I didn't have to ask, but please do consider pressing like and subscribe.